So anybody who gets there first will probably get some food. Is it possible to put the lights down slightly?
Yeah, just that button there.
Oh, thank you.
That's it.
Perfect. Right, so you can all fall asleep during my talk. So what I want to try to do today is to give you some insights into the discussions about the Anthropocene, both the actual concept of it and, of course, the downright dirty fights that are occurring within geology. Because this is science, so of course, are we all being nice to each other? Hell no. So, right. So my first question is to try and put to you what is and how is our environmental impact on the Earth? Because this is key if we are going to say we're in the Anthropocene. Because the Anthropocene says, fundamentally, that we are a geological superpower. And by we, I mean humanity. And we'll pick that apart, which parts of humanity we really mean. And the key thing is, are we now as powerful as plate tectonics? Are we having the same effect on the Earth as a meteorite impact? If so, we have entered a new geological period. So I'm going to use this wonderful planetary boundaries diagram from Will Stephan and preferably before that Romstorff and his work, and look at some of these boundaries. Now, the interesting thing about these boundaries, they are defined by a small committee of senior scientists who then go around going, ooh, yeah, we're sort of about there on that boundary. But it's a good starting point for my discussion. So I'm going to be looking at, briefly, biogeochemical flows. I'm going to be looking at climate change, of course. I'm going to be looking at land system change. And I'm going to be looking at biosphere integrity, all of which seem to be on the orange or the red phase of the planetary boundaries. So this diagram, if we just sum up our impact. So on the top left, humans fix half the nitrogen from the atmosphere into fertilizers. That's half everything. So that's the same as the natural processes. The last time the nitrogen cycle was this disruptive was about 2.5 billion years ago. Tick. Okay? Climate change, well, in the Grantham Institute, that really doesn't need any introduction. Increased CO2 by 48%, doubled methane in about 100 years. Land use. 25% of all the land, including Antarctica, is used for humans. Whether it's agriculture, our settlements, it is our usage. 1/4 of all the land is used by us. And then on the bottom right, we've already increased the extinction rate around the world 10-fold, and possibly in the future could increase that 100 to 1,000-fold, depending on how we go about it. Now, some people have called this the 6th mass extinction. However, as the geologists among you will know, we have got a long, long way to go before we hit extinction level event. But it's a warning sign that we're changing things. So all of those show the impact of humans. So we move more soil and rock and earth than all the natural processes combined. Damn those geologists. Okay? We have made enough concrete to cover the whole world in a layer 2 millimeter thick, and that includes the oceans. Okay? Damn the engineers. You can tell I'm in Imperial, can't you? Okay, we make over 300 million tons of plastic per year that can be found in every single ocean and also your drinking water. Damn the chemists. Okay, right. So, okay, I've hit all my academic colleagues. Right. Now, this is the fact that really blows people's minds. If we weigh the mammals on the land now, 30% of them are you lot, humans. There's 7.6 billion of us. That's a huge weight. However, 67% of the weight is actually our livestock and our pets. Only 3% by weight is wild animals. all those things that David Attenborough going running around looking at, that's just 3%. That's the change that humans have made. Okay, so let's take it as read. Welcome to the Anthropocene, and as Nature said for our review paper, the slice of Earth history during which people have become a major geological force. And then they asked this question, because that was part of the review: when did it begin? So, the Great Anthropocene Controversy. Now, the reason I've called it that is because it harks back to the days of the controversy over the Divensian and other periods of Earth history. Now, why is it controversial? It should be quite simple. You should get together, you should discuss it. Well, it's because of this. This is a beautiful piece of art. It's also 250 years of science. This is the geological timescale. This is to geologists what the periodic table is to chemists, okay? This is beautiful. It's lovely, okay? What it does is it takes 4.5 billion years of Earth history and it splits it up into meaningful chunks of time. Bits of time that are defined by different climates, different organisms on Earth, different states of the Earth system. And it's done by defining these boundaries where there are clear changes in the sediment, whether it's an extinction or whether it's an evolution of a new organisms, and you can then put in a golden spike. So the one down here at 66 million years is the death of the, I love this, non-avian dinosaurs. I still have trouble with that. It's a bit like Pluto being downgraded. I have real difficulty, and my youngest daughter hates it. Chickens, I'm sorry, are not dinosaurs, okay? Even though we're told that they are. So, non-avian dinosaurs died out. So we're looking at the top bit, the bit that's really boringly coloured in sort of like beige. And we're looking at, we're in the Cenozoic, we're in the Quaternary period, and we're in the Holocene epoch as defined. And they're defined by these golden spikes. Holocene is defined 11,650 years before present, present being 1950. And the interesting thing is geologists used to put golden spikes into the sediments, and they wondered why they kept disappearing. They don't get out much. So, you can tell I was a classically trained geologist, can't you? Right. So, you might have noticed that the Quaternary doesn't seem to fit. We have the Neogene, and then it goes into the Quaternary. We don't have a Tertiary. That's all gone. The reason being is every time the geological timescale is updated, the terminology is also updated. Except there was a revolution because the Quaternary was written out because it's old terminology, and of course the Quaternary geographers and geologists went to war and spent 8 years fighting in every committee to get it put back in. So we have an anathema. So the first thing to realize is the timescale is not necessarily logical or good science. Right, so this is the Holocene. The Holocene is defined by the warmest part of the end of the last ice age in the Deuterium, which is in the ice cores in Greenland. And as you can see, it's also as temperature and CO2 are both rising. However, I'll point out at this point that this part, the first half of the interglacial, the Holocene, looks like every other interglacial for the Quaternary. Okay? So why did they put a boundary there? And it gets worse, because there's the Anthropocene Working Group that has been diligently making up numbers randomly for the last 10 years, and then there's the Holocene Working Group that has been beavering away to undermine them. And the way they did this was brilliantly this summer. They got the IUGS to announce officially that there is no Anthropocene at the moment, but we are in the Megahelenian age. So the Holocene group, underneath the radar, had in their committee defined the early, middle, and late Holocene and gave them names. Ridiculous names like the first one is called the Greenlandian. The next one is the North Grippian, because, of course, the North Grip ice core. And then we have the Magellanian, because at 4,250 years before present, there was a large drought covering much of southern Europe, the Middle East, and India and China, which they've now called a global drought. I don't understand why. And this is the defining, which is really weird because it says nothing's really changed. We're the same as the last 4,000 years. We're in the Magellanian. Welcome to the politics of geology. So welcome to the Time Wars. This is basically the Anthropocene and Holocene working groups and their politics. And I can categorically tell you that both groups absolutely loathe Simon Lewis and myself. We had the audacity to review everything, publish it in Nature, and go, there you are, the whole story, make yourself a pig. So they hate us both, which I think is good. So, Simon and I published this review in Nature. We were then approached by Penguin and said, oh, this is great. People need to know about the Anthropocene. Could you write a book? And we looked at each other and went, sure. In the process of writing this book, which I have to say, writing with somebody else a book is a really interesting process, we actually formulated a new history of humanity. I know that's a very grand statement, isn't it? You can throw things at me later. Okay? The reason being is we suddenly realized that through natural sciences, we'd reinterpreted human societies through our impact. And we were wondering why we could do that. And the really interesting thing is that natural scientists are not time-locked. So, for example, all of you are working in the natural sciences. So you're happy dealing with milliseconds when you're dealing with earthquake release of energy. You're also happy dealing with 4.5 billion years of Earth history because that's what you do. And you're happy moving up and down this timescale without any stress. When you actually then work with social scientists, you find that they have their particular period. Okay? So, for example, human geography is in my own department. Anything older than 1950, they start to get a nosebleed. That's history. Okay? You then have historians. I work on the Second World War. I work on the Germans in the Second World War. You have people that work on the interwar period, but only on America. You have people work on the First World War, and all the way back through time. Mary Beard, a classicist at Oxford, does TV programs. She got huge trouble because she started talking about the ancient Greeks. And people harangued her on Twitter going, you only knew about the Romans. You know, they're not allowed to switch. Gets worse, you then get into the archaeologists. Bless them. You can work in the Neolithic or the Bronze Age, but you can't work in both. And then when you go to the paleoanthropologists, and I've still got all the scars and all the knives in my back from working with them, they work in a particular period of time, but they also work in a particular area. And even if somebody further down the Rift Valley is working on somebody else, they don't talk to them. So they're all time-locked. Well, we don't have that problem. So this is what our interpretation is, and then I'm going to go through it to try and show you what the impact is. So we suddenly realized that there are 5 modes of human society. So we start off with hunter-gatherers. Okay? And the revolution there is domestication, which occurs from about 13,000 at earliest all the way through. Okay? You then have agriculturalists. They spread out into all the continents. And then we have European expansionism and mercantile capitalism, the globalization of slavery and colonization. We then have the Industrial Revolution, industrial capitalism, the Great Acceleration after the Second World War, and consumer capitalism. There are some interesting rules that apply to each one of these boundaries. The first one is the number of people on the planet jumps up markedly with each one of these revolutions. The amount of energy used per person jumps up markedly. And the amount of knowledge that humanity has also jumps up markedly. But downside is, so does the environmental global impact. And we'll talk about this bit, post-capitalism, at the end. So stage 1, the early agriculture, the age of empire, and if there are any social scientists in the audience, I love you, and therefore, look, La Plantation-ocene, you know, everybody wants an ocene now because of the Anthropocene. So, agriculture developed in 10 to 14 places independently over a 6,000 year period, with Papua New Guinea probably being the latest. It's interesting, it spontaneously appeared in different places. And that's going to be an interesting thing compared with the other revolutions. So you move from a hunter-gatherer society to agrarian. You'll notice that sort of like it wasn't really good for our health, our height, our health, our longevity all probably dropped because this is really hard work and it basically limits your nutritional input, whereas this is a bit more laissez-faire and chilled. Expansion. So this is the example. The domesticated species were all found in the Middle East or in Asia, and then, of course, transplanted into the temperate zones, they flourished and took off. And you have this slow movement across. This also mimics other things I'm interested in, so lactose tolerance, the development of the enzyme to digest beer, and also blonde people, okay? All linked into this expansion. But I don't have time to talk about that. So, the empires. So we have the Mongolian, the Islamic, we have some big African ones, same with the Americas. And actually, their environmental impact wasn't necessarily as large as you would expect, but pointed out that, of course, Europe, yeah, a bit of a cesspit, okay? You really wouldn't look at this map going, yes, they're going to take over the world, okay? So there is something really interesting about the Europeans that's changed from this point onwards. This is where Bill Ruderman's work comes in because I told you that the start of the Holocene looks like every other interglacial. So the blue line is every other interglacial added together with an error bar, which is the blue errors. And as you notice, methane starts and goes down, down, down. CO2 starts high, goes down, down, down. You get to here, you drop into the next ice age. Works perfectly. Okay, except the Holocene does something weird. So about 5,000 years, methane starts to increase. About 6,000 years, CO2 increases. And it was Bill Ruderman who came up with this because he saw this and saw this must be something else. And it's interesting because this seems to be deforestation by humans when we're spreading out our agriculture, which means that there were a lot more of us then than we were expecting. And this methane here, this is the evolution of the wet rice paddy field in Asia that suddenly starts to take off, and also increased numbers of livestock. So the interesting thing is, I apologize, the interesting thing is, do we say the start of the Anthropocene is 5,000 years ago, it's all those peasant farmers that increased greenhouse gases by a small amount that stopped the next ice age? Well, that could be an interesting one. But no. So stage 2, globalization of humanity and the Capolocene, okay? I like that one. So it's all down to this. 1492, Columbus. Bad thing. So I'm not going to say that he discovered the Americas. I'm not going to say he rediscovered the Americas. There were 80 million people living there, okay? He bumped into the wrong continent and called it the West Indies because he thought he was somewhere else, okay? Let's put it in its context. But this is the start of the next revolution. This is the mercantile capitalists who are then going around the world starting to rape and pillage. So this is not a map. This is just, Ben's put this together. This is just the 18th and 19th century shipping logs to show you that globalization. And the key thing it did is it mixed species around the world. Okay? Now, this, firstly, remixed human populations between the new and old world. Okay? The Americas had been isolated from humanity, the rest of humanity, from about 13,000 years ago. It is the start of colonization and global slavery. Okay? It is also the irreversible movement of species. Okay? So what did we gain from the Americas? We got maize, potatoes, beans, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, avocados, cocoa, tobacco, and quinine. Okay? Think about Africa now. Cassava and maize are two of the main food sources in Africa. They come from South America. Okay? They are not native species. What did we give in return? Wheat, sugar, bananas, rice, grapes, horses, pigs, cattle, goats, sheep, chickens, smallpox, measles, typhus. Not a fair exchange. So this had a huge effect. And the problem is that at the moment, this is called the Columbian Exchange. Okay? And I'm actually trying to find a better word for this because it's not an exchange. So we brought over wave after wave of disease. And there are wonderful writings, very clear writings by the conquistadors who got there, who would walk into cities and everybody was already dead. The first wave that hit them was measles, then typhus, then flu, and then we got better with our ships and quicker at sailing, so we made it in less than a month, so smallpox could get there. And that then finished them off. Okay? They had no natural immunity because these diseases were developed by living with livestock and transferring from animals into humans. Okay? This group, 80 million people, had been isolated from those animals and diseases for 13,000 years. Okay? They had no natural immunity. So the really interesting thing is that, firstly, 50 million people dead. Actually, this number's gone up. There's a big review that's been accepted of ours in QSR. We think the number's probably closer to 54 million people. Okay? But that had a huge effect because they were all farmers. They were dead, so of course what happened is their farmland started to regrow with secondary forest growth, the savanna started to come back, and we have a drop in carbon dioxide, centered on 1610. So this regrowth was so large that the only time in the last 5,000 years that there's a drop in CO2, it's because of humanity. So Simon and I controversially suggested perhaps this is the start of the Anthropocene. Okay? This is the Orbis hypothesis, which is the Latin word for world. The reason being is because if we undid everything else on the planet, we undid climate change, we undid all the plastics, etc., the one thing that we cannot change is that exchange for species. Now forget diseases, I'll give you a really good example. If you go to North America and you dig up some soil, the earthworms that you'll find, the majority of them will be European. Okay? Yeah. The reason being, they have a little trick. So European earthworms basically go yummy, yummy, yummy in the soil, and then they go, oh, I'm hungry. And then they go up into the leaf litter, grab the leaf litter and pull it down and go, I can't be bothered to wait, I'll bring it down. The American earthworm's a bit more laissez-faire. It's like, I'm just going to wait till it rots. And therefore, they're completely outcompeted. Can you imagine us as a species going, no, we're going to return it to its natural state. We're going to repatriate all of those earthworms back to Europe. Okay? That's just earthworms. Just think of all the other species, okay? Including ourselves. Right. So this is what Simon and I suggested should be the golden spike. So CO2 drops in 1610, slowly comes back, but never at a high level until it takes off. So our thinking changed in 1492. We had the scientific revolution, whereby we rediscovered the sciences from Arabia and the ancient Greeks. And the interesting thing, coupled it with business and with commercial entities. And so therefore there was this synergy of science being produced for capitalism producing more science. I love this quote. This is by René Descartes, and he basically says, "In this great city where I am living, with no man apart from myself not being involved in trade, everyone is so intent on his profits that I could spend my whole life without being seen by anyone." Now that sounds like the city of London. Now, anybody know which city this is? It's Amsterdam, at the height of its capitalist power. Okay? Now, the really interesting thing is the reason why the Dutch Empire failed to mature, unlike the British and the French, was because it wasn't big enough. It didn't have the people to fuel that export and that work. So, it's also the age of slavery. So this is the slave trade from 1500 to 1870s. And you'll notice that West Africa moves huge amounts of slaves to South America and North America. The reason was twofold. One, there were 54 million people missing from the continent who couldn't work as slaves. Interesting, the second thing is, actually, the Spanish and the Portuguese really tried to get the South Americans to work as slaves. They just couldn't culturally do it. They were just predisposed that they would spend all their time trying to escape. And there's incredible documentations of the Spanish bitterly complaining how awful the locals were, and they just wouldn't cooperate and do what they were told. Interesting stuff. So, next stage, the Industrial Revolution and the Technocene. So this is the 1800s to the 1950s. Coal. Coal driving the next revolution. The idea that fossil fuels, not wood, you can use to actually boost energy and production. Now, the interesting thing is the Industrial Revolution was not inevitable. And this is something that we really pick up in the book. Agriculture spontaneously occurs in 14 places. Okay? Admittedly at different times, but they all happens. The Industrial Revolution only happens once, in the Midlands, in 1840. And it spreads across the whole Europe like a virus in 40 years. In those 40 years, it's also contaminated the United States, Canada, and Japan. But think about it. The Chinese Empire lasted 5,000 years, never had an industrial revolution. The Byzantine Empire lasted for thousands of years, never had an industrial revolution. The Roman Empire, no industrial revolution. So there's some really interesting things about why this happened. So the first thing is the depopulation. Oh, I apologize. The depopulation of the Americas. Suddenly, there's a whole continent which is producing resources and food that can be imported into Europe, which means that the agricultural limitations on population size, and you'll see that before this period of time, a huge shift in population due to famine, because you have just enough people to produce just enough food for those people. Once you free up a whole continent, which you can then use and actually buy in food, that changes the population dynamics. There's also another reason, which is geography. So if you think about China, China is a very large landmass. It has a really boring coastline. It has desert on the top, mountains on the side, and then it has two rivers that sort of split it up. So if you're going to geographically split up China, you have upper, middle, and lower China. That's really it. It's a huge continent that isn't split up. If you're going to start looking at Europe, Europe has a really annoying coastline, okay? And I'll go back here. And it has these annoying bits. So it has these sticky out bits, these islands that all think they're independent, like this one. You have places like Spain and Portugal, big mountain range, so it feels it's separate. And then in the heart of Europe, you have a mountain range, which the rivers all run out like that. You have a radial system. So the geography fragments the people and produces, look at the countries, produces smaller groups of people that feel that they are independent and separate and, in our case, special. Okay? Now, key thing is, these were all ruled by princes, kings, and the interesting thing is they're all related to each other. So you find that actually they spent the 15th, 16th, and 17th century trying to kill each other. This is the percentage of years the great powers fought each other. So this period of time, it's about 90% of the time, okay? Because the thing is, if you happen to be king of a small kingdom in the middle of Europe and you lost a war, damn, I lost 10,000 peasants and my cousin beat me. Right, what can I do? I'm going to pay mercenaries to come in. I'm going to pay technologists to actually improve the technology I've got. So by the beginning of the 18th century, Europe had wooden ships that could fire a metal cannonball with perfect accuracy over a mile. That acceleration, this set of wars, accelerated the actual military technology and all the other technology, driving it forward. At one point, the Royal Navy in Britain took 25% of the government's revenue. £1 in £4 went straight to the actual Royal Navy. Admittedly, that was to keep the French out, but that was there. It also changes our thinking. So the Industrial Revolution comes with major changes with the idea of Karl Marx, socialism, and a different way of thinking about it. We're not worried about the peasant classes, we're now worried about the working classes. And as you can see, my little thing, it gets even worse for you if you happen to be in a factory. You basically get less food, less sanitation, etc., etc. So, can we find somewhere in the Industrial Revolution to be a golden spike? Is this really the start of the Anthropocene? Well, CO2-wise, nothing really happens at the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, it started! Yeah. But actually, the CO2 rise is about the same as the previous 50 years. We get an increase from the 1900s as it starts to pick up around the world, and this virus is spreading. But it's from the 1950s onwards that actually this great acceleration occurs. So, the great acceleration, neoliberalism, and you're going to love this one, Cthulhuocene, okay? Yes, I have dived into feminist literature, and yes, we will talk about that, and I will force you to understand. Actually, no, I'm not sure I understand, but we'll try, okay? So, the whole world, as you know it, changed after the Second World War at the Bretton Woods Conference and the other conferences within a year. The reason being is the Allies had planned the peace. They basically had decided early on they really were going to win. We are going to win. We are going to win. We are going to win. And what they did was they got their brightest and best to draw up plans. And these were called desk draw plans. They had them. And as soon as peace was declared, they all went slap on the table and started to compare and to basically compete what was the vision of the post-war world. How could they avoid the mistakes after the First World War? Now, one key thing was they didn't control the global economy. Governments weren't in control. They didn't control exchange rates. So they realized that actually to manage the system, governments had to be fully involved. So they set up the United Nations, they set up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to make sure the problems did not occur as had happened in the interwar period. They also set the gold standard, so 1 ounce of gold was $35, and of course, the dollar became the international currency. Okay? despite the British complaining bitterly. We were just ignored. So, how big was this acceleration? That's 1950. This is the increase in energy use around the world. Huge, massive change. Population, 1950, present day. Oh, present day. Since 1950, we have doubled the world population. That's an extra 3.5 billion people who are now alive and have survived. Now, that's because of the industrial medical complex allowing the production of cheap vaccinations and solutions to preventable health issues. The second thing is the Green Revolution allowed people to use and have crops which were more productive. Fertilizers, all that nitrogen we're fixing, allows us to feed 7.6 billion people on the planet, not necessarily equitably. And as you notice, so I put this diagram together, it covers sort of 10 million years in log scale, but it was to say, look, spread of agriculture, great, but then it's accelerated now in the last 50 years. Deforestation has accelerated, atmospheric CO2, and of course methane. So the last 50 years have been a huge change. Now, the Anthropocene Working Group, bless them, how do I say this politely? Actually, no, let's not. Okay, I've said this so many times in public, they're going to get me anyway. They're not particularly scientific. So they keep announcing things without evidence. So they did state at one of the geological congresses, they said, we believe the Anthropocene is real, there is enough evidence for it, and we think it should start sometime post-1950. We are now going to spend the next few years finding evidence for it. No, you collate all the evidence, put it all together, and then you define it. So the thing is that they have, unfortunately, a political agenda. They believe this is all, the Anthropocene is all due to the evil American empire, and it's all post-1950 because of climate change. It's all back to the politics of climate change. So they originally suggested it should be the first nuclear bomb in the 1940s. That's the start. Except it doesn't leave a trace. So how can you have a marker? Then they said, oh, perhaps it's the first increase in radiocarbon in the atmosphere. Yeah, that doesn't work. So Simon and I came along and said, well, hang on. You have a beautiful bomb spike. So the radiocarbon peaks at 1964. And the reason it drops is because in 1963, there is a partial nuclear test bomb treaty. The reason being is the world suddenly woke up to the fact that testing nuclear weapons above ground probably wasn't a good idea, and it's not that healthy. It took until 63 to get an agreement, and since 63, there haven't been any. So, oh, by the way, they still test a lot of nuclear weapons underground. It's just above ground, that's why it's partial. And as you can see, the radiocarbon drops down. So you can see this spike in sediments, in tree rings, beautifully there. There you are. That will be a beautiful starting point. We also have to see that after that, oh, and by the way, Simon and I don't like that because just having evidence of the ability to destroy the whole world doesn't really sum up the Anthropocene for us. Also, I have an issue with it because as much as I have major issues with my parents, okay, I'm pretty sure they weren't born in a different geological period to me, okay? You know, it's just wrong on so many levels, okay? So, 1980s, the emergence of neoliberalism. So we have the post-war period where governments controlled the markets to ensure that basically development occurred. And then economists with true hearts, don't get me wrong, okay, they truly believed this was the right thing to do, said we must take the training wheels off the economy. We should let the markets completely go wild because that's going to lift everybody up out of poverty quicker than basically the markets being controlled. And I love this. And to the poor of the world we say this, remember, we're counting on you to keep us rich. International Monetary Fund 2 years ago said the last generation of economic policies may have been a complete failure. Now, the IMF is not a left-wing think tank, okay? So, oops. So the true state of the world, okay? 7 million children die needlessly every year. That's the population of Greater London. 700 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night. That's just lack of calories. Forget nutrition. 1 billion people, that's 1 in 7, still do not have access to safe, clean drinking water. Now, of course, let's be realistic. It's probably because we don't have enough money. I mean, we just don't have enough money to look after all those poor people or change the system. Well, this is GDP growth that I've plotted since 1600, okay? As you can see, we're on the straight up bit. What is really scary for an environmentalist or an environmental scientist is in the next 25 years, the global economy will double. That is more than all the other doublings up to now. Can you imagine how much damage we would do with twice the wealth that we have now? Okay? So that is why it's a really important thing to consider. Oh, and just to put it into a context, in 2018, even with Brexit, UK GDP will be $2.9 trillion. That's how much money we generate this year in this country. And so I would just ask this question, why are there poor people? I'll just leave that out there. Yeah. So I'm a geographer. I apologize. I know it's a stuff to take. But look, population, money. Population, money. I can do this all day. So as you can see, there's no links between where the people are and where the money is. So just to really make your evening, and hopefully if you go away with any one fact, it's this. The richest 1% of adults, which you will be joining or already part of, last year took 82% of the wealth generated in the world. Okay? The bottom half, 3.6 billion people, own about less than 1%. So Oxfam did this wonderful thing. It's a really good think tank. They said, okay, right, let's take the bottom half and compare it with the richest billionaires. And so basically, the first time they did this in 2010, they got 388 of the richest billionaires, same as the bottom half. And then they noticed this number kept going down. Okay? And so basically by 2015, they got to the same amount as, say, in this room. So if you were the richest billionaires in the world, I know, wouldn't that be lovely? A, you'd be deeply stressed and psychologically damaged, but you would own the same amount of wealth as 3.5 billion people. It's very scary. However, of course, you really, really want to know what happened. Well, yeah, guess what? It's now down to 42 people. So I'm sorry, you at the back, you're out of this. Right, 42 people. So this is where the Cthulhuocene comes in. So Donna Haraway is a brilliant feminist thinker, thinks in the environment, and what she sees is that we have a male, technocratic, white, Western approach to the global economy. We have our tentacles everywhere. Oh, by the way, she also spells Cthulhuocene wrongly on purpose and then tries to justify it in her paper. I'm sorry. I'm a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. If you're going to use it properly. So I spell it correctly, just because I'm a geek. Okay? So, and of course, the Cthulhu is this monster that lies beyond Pluto, is waiting to come and devour the planet. She argues it's already happening. And then she takes from that different ways of how we should envisage the future. So, okay, having done all this, why does defining the Anthropocene matter? Why does an obscure word actually matter? Well, the first thing is, now we've seen how much impact we're having through this, we can start to think through the laws. So the first thing is population. We are controlling population. We're the first organism to self-organize and go, hey, we shouldn't have so many of us, okay? The really interesting thing is the major control on population growth is women's education beyond secondary school level, or up to secondary school level. So it's really interesting. If you have any society, doesn't matter what religion, doesn't matter how developed, doesn't matter. As long as you have women up educated to secondary school level and beyond, they take control of their fertility and the population starts to stabilize. Okay? So it's really interesting that we become a unique species by controlling our own population because of female empowerment. It's a really interesting thing if you're a geologist, okay? So that's the first one. Tick. Admittedly, it's probably going to be about 10 billion people by 2050. It might drop after that. But it isn't 20 billion, it's 10, okay? Second thing is energy use. Now we know energy use will have to go up because we need to lift people out of abject poverty and we need to actually deal with that in certain ways. I'm sorry, Pandora's box is open. You've all got those magic little boxes that tell you any information you want to know in the world, okay? Problem is that we're never going to be able to stop knowledge. That's fine. What we have to do is say, energy and knowledge, how do we use those, and population growth, how do we decouple those from environmental impact? And in the book, we actually argue that there's a number of ways of doing that. So there's three potential GSSPs, or golden spikes. One is, of course, here, it's all the peasant farmers causing the ice age to go away. It's the mass murder of the American indigenous people, or it's the ability to destroy ourselves, which is shown by the bomb spike and the great acceleration. But the reason why the Anthropocene is important is because scientists have changed the way people think about themselves. Okay? So firstly, it was Galileo, Copernicus, they ruined it. They then suddenly pointed out that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Actually, in the solar system, it was the sun. And then you have people like Brian Cox coming along going, well, our sun is rather dull. It's not particularly special, and it's one of 10 to the 24 stars in our galaxy, which is one of many galaxies in our universe. Ooh, that makes you that small, okay? It's like, And then, of course, not to be outdone, the biologists get involved. They go, oh yeah, okay, you know how it used to be plants, animals, man, and it was man, angels, God? Yeah, guess what? Don't have a special place. I'm sorry, you're just a naked, slightly smart chimpanzee running around, basically trying to put a top hat on, okay? Makes you that small. So science has made individuals feel really insignificant. We're small, just a small part of a very, very, very big universe. Except the Anthropocene says we are the most important force on Earth. We control the environment and the evolutionary destiny of all the organisms on the planet. Therefore, we now are the most important control on Earth. The only place that we know that life exists in the universe. Zero to hero. It means that we have to consider that power very seriously because it's different from nature. It's reflective. We can decide to increase the damage or we can decrease the damage. We can rewild. We can deforest. We have very different power to nature. I will warn you though, when you're thinking about these things, and this is Kathleen Yossef's stuff, very, very good thinker from Queen Mary, she pointed out that, of course, this is all about white geology. Okay? You'll notice it's white, male, old geology. Unfortunately, I'm starting to fall into that camp, which really upsets me. Okay? So there you are. Are we allowed to define the future and the present by being white Western males? After this, they got lots of hassle by mansplaining the world, and therefore they invited a couple of white women onto their Anthropocene working group. Way to go, diversity. Again, the interesting thing is with each one of the transitions that I talked about, there are major losers. The indigenous people or the ones that do not transfer get hit really badly. It also means that we have a vision of the future. Okay? We can see a world where resources are shared out beautifully. And what was quite amazing about the 1.5 degree global warming report by the IPCC is it implicitly said, if you keep the world to 1.5 degrees, you will make a safer, more equal, better world. Very, very implicit. Or perhaps we're going for the bad Anthropocene. And unfortunately, I find that I have to explain this slide to everybody because most people are now so young that they don't realize which film this is. Anybody realize it? Some of the old people? Yes. So it's the original Planet of the Apes. There's Charlton Heston. He thinks he's on a strange alien planet. It turns out to be Earth in the future, and we've burnt it all up. And he's banging his fist on the sand there, okay? So doom or happiness, okay? So we're at that turning point. The IPCC 1.5 degrees report was also incredibly radical. It linked the future to the SDGs. So instead of dealing with climate change as an isolated problem that had to be dealt with, it said, look, there are lots of issues in the world. That includes rapid development, poverty alleviation, global security, and climate change. These things have to be done in concert. And they showed where there would be winning and losing trade-offs in each one of the things. So, thank you for listening. I always appreciate people making the time and effort to actually listen to me. And also, if you're interested, all of this is in much greater detail and has solutions. That's why I never tell you about solutions until you ask questions. It's all in the last 2 chapters. And by the way, you can get it here in the United Kingdom. It's quite cheap. It's a Pelican book. Or you can get it in America with a glossy cover. I have to say that because one colleague came up to me and I felt really stupid. They went, I didn't know you've written 2 books. No, it's the same book published in 2 different continents. So if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Just to start on the microphone. So it won't come through this bit. This is to record it on the thing. So have we got any questions? You won't be able to hear your voice.
It's just for the Panoptico thing. Hi, I'm Geraldine. I'm one of the DTP students here. I have 2 questions. The first one is you said when you're talking about slave trade that it was interesting that the South Americans weren't prone to slavery. Does that imply that there's evidence that somehow Africans would be more prone to being slaves?
So the interesting thing there was what we find is that they needed people that had already had slavery. So there was a cultural imprint of what slavery was. And so, no, it didn't mean that Africans were any better as slaves. It meant that they had already been, it already happened to them because the different tribes within West Africa would actually use each other as slaves. There was no view of slavery within the Americas on the coastline where they were evading. And so the problem was that they had great difficulty. The other thing that they found was that the people were frail. And I don't mean frail as in weak. It's just that even when they had them as slaves, they kept dying of diseases. And so it was just much easier to import in sort of like a population that they knew were already resilient to diseases to actually do it. Another interesting, so a flip side to that was, say, the British bringing in Indians who had already organized the civil service in India, brought them into East Africa to run East African countries because they'd already trained them. So it's purely that.
Okay.
Second question?
Second question was on the Industrial Revolution. So the usual explanation for it is more put forward as a combination of the scientific revolution combined with mercantilism. So the way that we actually changed our mind into what we could actually do, our influence on the world by observing the world and applying it to our own advantage. Is there any reason why you picked a more geographical explanation?
The reason being is, why did the scientific revolution come about? I think there are drivers before that. I also think that's a very scientific point of view. It's because of us, that's why we then went. I think it's driven by scientists' ego, that it's that drives the society. Interesting, there are some other things that I would say were really important. Firstly, Henry VIII. You didn't think you would come to Imperial to hear about Henry VIII. Henry VIII removed all the internal tariffs from the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was called at the time. Okay? Amazing. So you could trade without any problems. Russia had internal tariffs until 1890. That stops trade. Yeah, exactly. How can you build an empire when you're doing that? Okay? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, Britain had also removed the absolute monarchy. Now, the problem is, if you were in one of the countries that had an absolute monarch, if you built a company up, he just goes, yeah, no, I'm having that. But the rule of law that occurred because of William and Mary, who basically gave up their absolute monarchy and basically agreed Parliament that there would just be a figurehead in many ways, the rule of Parliament meant that laws actually worked. And so therefore you could have contracts that you could defend in a court of law. And so all of that builds up to allow the Midlands, particularly with a large population who are already working in their houses, they were basically making cotton clothes in their spare time as well as working on the land. That then was allowed that industrial to take root. But that's important because you need all those pieces, because it never happened anywhere else. Does that help? That was my favourite chapter to write. Sorry.
Yeah, Simon Pirani, I write about the history of fossil fuels. Thanks for that. Two questions as well. First, what responsibility do we as researchers have to each other in terms of breaking down the divide that you've described, first of all, between natural scientists and social scientists, or natural historians and social historians, and I mean there are then the subdivisions that you've talked about, and secondly, what responsibility do we have in terms of changing society? Should we all not be here, and should we all be out demonstrating? What should we be doing?
So, okay, so two huge questions. Right, so the first one is, so I live what I believe. So I work with engineers, medics, historians, economists. So I'm really naughty because I will work on any project that I think is interesting with the people who are specialists in that field. And so we, doing this, read a huge amount, talked to huge amounts of people, and therefore I've published papers on the green economy. So I'm saying to you, yes, do your PhD, which has to be very narrow, etc. You have to make sure you tick all the boxes. You are brilliant in that field. Then after that, go mad, okay? The reason being is because that's what being an academic is about. And so, yes, no, I think it's also knowing that people at the top of their fields, this was John Schellenhuber told me this. He said he's never had any issue with anybody at the top of their field, whether it happens to be the leading dancer, opera singer, Angela Merkel, it doesn't matter. They are all really open and brilliant people. The layer of wannabes underneath, who are never going to make it to the top, they're a pain. But the top, so again, always works. So if you want to work with economists, go and find the best of the best, because they'll be going, oh, that'd be cool. Yeah. So that's the first question. Second question, how do you solve it? So in the book, we